Okay, we are back now for part two, and we still have quite a bit of information to cover, so we're going to just kind of dive right in. And we left off, we're still under psychological theories, and we're going to talk a little bit about personality and crime. So, some psychologists view criminal behavior as a function of a disturbed personality structure. Okay, and personality can be defined as the reasonably stable pattern of behavior, including thoughts and emotions, that distinguish one person from another. The terms psychopath and sociopath are commonly used to describe people who have antisocial personalities, defined as a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others that begins in childhood and continues all the way through adulthood. So, those that suffer from these types of things, from this disease, if you will, usually exhibit at least three of the following things. So, failure to conform to social norms, deceitfulness, impulsivity, irritability, disregard for safety, irresponsibility, or lack of remorse. So, people with an antisocial personality are believed to be dangerous and aggressive individuals who act in a callous manner. They neither learn from their mistakes nor are deterred by punishments. And although they may appear charming and have average intelligence, etc., they do lack emotional depth, are capable of caring for others, and maintain a kind of a low level anxiety, traits that are linked to violence and other forms of criminality. So again, personality and crime. What about IQ? Well, one of the most enduring controversies in the psychology of crime is the relationship between intelligence as measured by standardized intelligent quotients, tests, or the IQ tests, and violent or criminal behavior. So again, there is a link between intelligence and crime, and it is one of the most kind of interesting pathways, if you will. Numerous studies link low IQ to violent and aggressive behavior and crime. Some evidence, okay, not a bunch, but some shows that people who act aggressive in social settings also tend to have a lower IQ than their peers. Now, that's not always the case, but some studies have found that have found a direct IQ delinquency link, if you will, among samples of adolescent boys. Although evidence is kind of persuasive, many experts dispute that the IQ/crime relationship exists. So these are just things for us to think about, and this is IQ and crime that falls under psychological theory. Now, what about sociological theories? So sociological criminology is traced to the pioneer work of Emile Durkheim, who viewed crime as a social phenomenon. And as the field of criminology emerged in the 20th century, greater emphasis was then kind of focused on environmental conditions. And this is where you equate the cause of criminal behavior with social factors, right? And we kind of think about that. So things like perhaps poverty and unemployment, etc. So falling underneath this umbrella, okay, would be what we call social structure theory. And this suggests that, people's place in the socioeconomic structure influences their chances of becoming a criminal. It kind of has the opinion that poor individuals are more likely to commit crimes because they are unable to achieve monetary or social success in another way. So the term itself, social structure, is defined kind of as the stratifications of classes, institutions, and groups that characterize a society. Within the social structure theory, you might have racial disparity. Okay, the problems of lower class culture are particularly acute for racial and ethnic minorities, and what kind of falls underneath there is a term called culture of poverty. So, the crushing burden, if you will, of poverty brings on the development of this culture of poverty. And this subculture is marked by, apathy, cynicism, helplessness, and distrust. And the culture is passed from one generation to the next, creating a permanent kind of underclass, if you will, referred to as the disadvantaged. But by definition, culture of poverty would be people in the lower class of society. They have a separate and sometimes violent culture. Okay, and that's the view of this particular theory. All right, so again, we're talking about sociological theories. Next would be what we call the disorganized neighborhood. So the effects of income equality, poverty, racism, and despair are, a key cause of youth crime and drug abuse. Kids who grew up poor and living in households that lacked economic resources are much more likely to get involved in serious crime than wealthier peers. Now, it's not always like that, so keep that in mind when you think about these different theories. So these neighborhoods lack what we call collective efficacy, and this is a condition of mutual trust and cooperation that develops in neighborhoods that have that high level or higher level of social control. Disorganized neighborhoods may possess deviant values and cultures, and something that we call strain, as legitimate avenues for success are all but closed, meaning no jobs. I mean all kinds of things. The community is run down. There's no services. There's no jobs. Maybe there's bad water supply, all that kind of stuff. Okay, that's kind of what they're talking about here. So it kind of all that strain kind of opens up that avenue for crime, because the avenue to success in a regular route, if you will, is kind of closed because of all of these issues. So that's part of the disorganized neighborhood. In lower class neighborhoods, strain, or what we call status frustration, occurs because legitimate avenues for success are all but closed. And frustrated by this, people may use other means to get ahead or obtain their goals, right? So by definition, strain, so you know what it is, it's defined as the emotional turmoil and conflict caused when people believe they can't achieve their desired goals through legitimate means. So that means that they might, doesn't mean that they will, it means that there's a possibility they could use a different means to get there. And on page 104 in your textbook, you can see they have a really easy to read kind of chart that talks about the sources of strain. Okay, and it's maybe failure to achieve goals, expectations, removal of positive stimuli, okay, etc. And it kind of turns into this. Okay, these are the negative effects, and then the effects of that could end up being this antisocial behavior. So this is actually a diagram of Agnew's sources of strain and their consequences. So you can read a little bit more about strain on page 103 in your textbook, okay? All right, so now we're going to kind of move on, and we're going to talk about, and we're still under sociological theories, social process theories. We're going to talk about social learning theory, okay? And this is the view that human behavior is learned through observation of human interactions directly from those in close proximity or even by the media. It suggests that people learn the techniques and attitudes of crime from close relationship like your friends or your peers. And it's most well known, in this area would be Sutherland's differential association theory, where he talks about attitudes and behaviors and values that cause crime are actually learned in those close, intimate relationships. So next, still under the social process theories, let's talk about social control theory. And this maintains that everyone has the potential to become a criminal, but that most people are controlled by their bonds to society. And therefore, crime occurs when the forces that bind people together to society are weakened or are broken. And then finally, we have social reaction or labeling theory. Okay, and this suggests that people become criminals when significant members of society label them as such. And then at some point, they begin to accept those labels as an actual personal identity, if you will. Okay, and you can learn a lot more. If you want to read a little bit more, you can start on page 105, and you can go through page, well, let's say about 107. And it kind of talks about all these different theories. All right, so now we're going to kind of push forward a little bit, and we're going to talk about critical criminology. So critical criminology views the economic and political forces operating in society as the fundamental cause of criminality. The criminal law and the criminal justice systems are seen as vehicles for controlling the poor. And the criminal justice system helps the powerful and rich impose their own morality and standards of good behavior on the entire society while protecting their property and physical safety from the have-nots, if you will, even though the cost may be the legal rights of those that could be in the lower class. So by definition, critical criminology is the view that crime results because the rich and powerful impose their own moral standards and economic interests on the rest of society. And again, criminal law, the criminal justice system are basically in favor of or help the powerful impose their own morality, right? They set the standard of good behavior on all of us, if you will, on the entire society. And crime in any society is caused by class conflict. And finally, laws are created by those in power to protect their rights and their interests, but not those, the others, not those of others in society. State organized crime, still kind of under the realm of critical criminology. So, critical theorists argue that the mainstream criminologists often focus on the crimes of the poor and the powerless while ignoring the illegal acts of the rich and powerful. For example, they have identified state-organized crimes, which would be acts defined by law as criminal and committed by state officials, both elected and appointed, in pursuit of their jobs as government representatives. And these antisocial behaviors arise from other, efforts either to maintain their power or to uphold unfair advantages acquired by those who support the government. So by definition, criminal acts committed by state officials in pursuit of their jobs as government representatives. And these state corporate crimes may occur when a state institution, such as, let's say, the Environmental Protection Agency, that fails to enforce laws, resulting in more pollution to waterways. State crime also involves violations of citizens' trust through crimes like soliciting bribes, etc. Politicians, judges, law enforcement, and government regulators engage in corruption that will end up damaging public trust. So this is kind of, again, under the realm of critical criminology and some of the views that fall underneath that. What is some support for critical criminology? Well, it's routinely supported by research. Criminologists routinely found evidence that measures social inequity. Support also exists that criminal justice systems can function as tools of oppression. And the conclusion here is that as people become economically marginalized, meaning that as things kind of decrease, okay, more to a margin versus high, they will turn to crime, even violent crime, for survival, producing an inevitable upswing in the number of street crimes. So think of this from an economic standpoint, is kind of what they're telling you. As economics, kind of start to crumble, and maybe if you were, kind of categorically middle class and more people are being pushed down a little bit, if you will, let's say to a lower rung, then perhaps that might kind of have a reverse effect and then an upswing in the number of street crimes. All right, and then we're getting close to the end, but we're going to talk a little bit now about developmental theory. Okay. Developmental theories seek to identify, describe, and understand the developmental factors that explain the onset and continuation of a career criminal. So by definition, this is a view of crime holding that as people travel through the life course, their experience along the way will influence their behavior patterns. And that behavior changes at each stage of that human experience. So developmental theorists want to know not only why people enter a criminal way of life, if you will, but also whether once they do, are they able to alter that trajectory? So kind of an interesting thought, right? Life course theories, and this is another theory that we're going to talk about, and then we'll go into a couple of different theories. So life course theories suggest that events take place over the life course to influence criminal choices. And the causes of crime constantly change as people mature. Okay, so this is part of the, under developmental theories, etc. At first, the nuclear family influences behavior. And then in adolescence, the peer group starts to kind of influence and dominate. And then in adulthood, you have marriage and career that are critical. So you can see, when you talk about life course theories, how things might change, right? You start off with the family influence, and then you go to the peer group influence, and then, perhaps if you get married and you have a career, these are become more critical and your influence. And it kind of helps explain career criminality. And there's a term that's out there. It's called early onset. Okay. So one important aspect of criminal career development is this early onset. Basically, people who are antisocial during adolescence are the ones most likely to remain criminals throughout their lifespan. The earlier the onset of criminality, the more frequent, varied, and sustained the criminal career. Okay, so again, the beginning of antisocial behavior during early adolescence, which after which criminal behavior is more likely to persist. So, and then, on page 113 in your textbook, it kind of shows the path of life, if you will. Okay, so it's kind of, under life course theory, right? So this kind of explains it, how things go, and you can see conventional behavior, criminal behavior, and you start off with the family and you kind of go, all the way down here. So kind of an interesting theory for us to look at. All right, so by definition, again, let's kind of look at a couple of other theories as we start to close things out. So life course theory, okay? The view that criminality is a dynamic process influenced by people's perceptions and experiences throughout their lives, which may change their behavior for better or worse. You have age-graded theory. Turning points in the criminal career are life events that enable people to kind of, they call it knife off, but, kind of cut away from a criminal career path into a conventional lifestyle. Okay. So that's another kind of theory, if you will. You have what's called latent trait theory, the view that human behavior is controlled by a master trait present at birth or soon after that influences and directs behavior. So that's kind of an interesting theory in itself. You have the general theory of crime. And this is best known, the best known latent trait theory by Michael Goffredson and Travis Hershey under their general theory of crime. And here they believe that individual differences in the tendency to commit criminal acts can be found in a person's level of self-control. So that's really the big thing when you talk about their theory. So again, in general, both Gottfredson and Hershey argue that individual differences in the tendency to commit criminal acts can be found in somebody's self-control. So what that means is that people with limited self-control tend to be impulsive, insensitive, physical rather than mental, risk-taking, short-sighted, nonverbal, etc. They have a here and now kind of, orientation, if you will, and refuse to kind of, plan things out. They might lack diligence, tenacity, and persistence. And people lacking self-control tend to be, adventuresome and active and physical and self-centered. And as they mature, they might end up in unstable marriages, jobs, friendships, etc. So that's kind of how their theory works, but it's really based around the idea of self-control. You have trajectory theory, okay, and this combines elements of both the latent trait and life course theory. Okay, so the basic premise is that there is more than one path to crime and more than one class of offender. So because of that, there are different trajectories in a criminal career. According to this view, not all persistent offenders begin at an early age, nor do they take the same path to crime. Some are precocious, beginning their offending early in adolescence and persisting into adulthood, and others stay out of trouble and they don't violate the law until their teenage years. So they're kind of like late bloomers, right? So this is kind of a combination of elements of latent trait and life course theory. Then there's adolescent limited and life course persistent offenders. So adolescent limited offenders are typical teenagers whose misbehavior ends when they enter adulthood. And that might be with a lot of us, right? I mean, we start off kind of adventuresome as teenagers and we do things we're not supposed to do. And then as we get into adulthood, we get busier and things like that, and something kind of changes in our life and we kind of get out of that other stuff. Now, life course persisters are those that they consider to be delinquent, who begin their offending career at an early age and then continue to offend well into adulthood. All right, a couple more and we'll wrap up our theories, but I want you to know on page 115, there's an entire list of all of these theories that we're talking about, and there's the theory on the left, and on the right-hand side is the major premise. And that's a really good thing to kind of go back and look at, because it's only like 1 or 2 sentences that's the descriptor, right? So it'll have the theory and then kind of a little 1 or 2 sentence premise next to it. So it'll help you out quite a bit. All right, so victim precipitation theory examines the role of the victim in the criminal, in the criminal incident. And this is important because we really don't talk a lot about victimization. So for many years, criminological theory focused on the actions of the offender, right? And the role of the victim was kind of ignored. Then a number of scholars found that the victim is not a passive target in crime, but someone whose behavior actually could influence what happens to them. And that's kind of an interesting thought. So when you define victim precipitation, it's the role of the victim in provoking or encouraging criminal behavior. So Hans von Henting portrayed the crime victim as someone who shapes and molds the criminal. And again, the criminal may be a predator, but the victim may help the criminal by becoming willing prey, right? Maybe by, go to the ATM at 1 o'clock in the morning by yourself when it's dark. You see what I mean? So that's kind of how they talk about that victim precipitation theory. It really looks at the role of the victim and how they play a part in their own victimization, if you will. Then there's lifestyle theory, which suggests that some people may become crime victims because their lifestyle increases their exposure. So some criminologists really believe that people, and this is sort of true, right? That people may become crime victims because their lifestyle, again, increases their exposure to certain criminal offenders. So victimization risk is increased by such behaviors like associating with violent individuals, going out in public places late at night, living in real urban areas. And research has also confirmed that young women who engage in substance abuse and come in contact with men who are also substance abusers will also increase the likelihood that they could be, doesn't mean they will be, but they could be sexually assaulted. Okay? Although we often think of criminals as victimizing others, people who engage in crime and gang activity actually have a very high rate of victimization themselves, right? Carrying a weapon is another surefire way to become a victim. Males who carry weapons are about 3 times more likely to be victimized than those who are unarmed. So this is an important theory. So lifestyle theory suggests that a person can reduce their chances of victimization by lowering or reducing their risk-taking. And that kind of makes sense. Then you have routine activities theory. And this theory holds that the incidence of criminal activity and victimization is related to the nature of normal everyday patterns of human behavior. Okay? So it's a view of crime that is a product of what we call motivated offenders, suitable targets, and a lack of capable guardians. And, it's those 3 things. So it's the view of crime that a product of 3 everyday factors kind of comes into play. And you kind of look at it like this. And the thought behind the theory is that if you were to take one of these away, the crime wouldn't happen. So if you don't make yourself a suitable target, if there isn't a motivated offender, or there are capable guardians, then chances are that crime really wouldn't take place, right? So again, it's kind of an interesting kind of theory, right? The presence of these components, okay, increases the likelihood that a predatory crime will take place. For example, increasing the number of motivated offenders and placing them in close proximity to valued goods will increase the property victimizations. Similarly, the presence of valuable, targets increases the likelihood of crime and victimization. So this is what they call routine activities theory, and again, it talks about those three components. If you look on page 118 in your textbook, you can find this chart, and you can see how it talks about the capable guardians are, police, neighborhood watch, security, homeowners that kind of look at your house, etc. And if you have these, it's all of these, it kind of adds up to these three little bubbles, if you will, that kind of formalize routine activities theory. Okay, so that's going to wrap us up. I know it was quite a lot. We're just right about the 30-minute mark. We did kind of jump through a few things kind of quickly, but that's okay. So this will conclude part 2 of our chapter 3 lecture, Understanding Crime and Victimization.